One of them spent decades slowly losing control of his own body, while the entire world watched in heartbreak. Another vanished from Hollywood after personal struggles and emotional collapse nearly destroyed everything. One cast member battled addiction and public humiliation long after the fame faded. And behind the adventure, humor, and timeless magic of Back to the Future, there were real lives shaped by illness, pressure, regret, and the painful passage of time. For millions of people, Back to the Future was never just a movie. It was childhood itself. The DeLorean, the clock tower, the sound of Huey Lewis playing while Marty McFly skateboarded through Hill Valley like the coolest teenager in America. The film made audiences believe time travel could feel emotional, fun, hopeful, and somehow deeply human. But while the world remembers the cast as forever young, real life moved forward without mercy. Bodies aged, careers changed, friendships drifted apart. And for one beloved star in particular, life became a heartbreaking battle against a disease that slowly stole pieces of him year after year. The audience saw confidence on screen, but behind the cameras there were fears nobody could stop. Hidden pain, emotional exhaustion, the crushing pressure of becoming permanently attached to one of the most iconic films in Hollywood history. Because Back to the Future did something very few movies ever achieve. It froze its cast inside American memory forever. Michael J. Fox would always be Marty McFly. Christopher Lloyd would always be Doc Brown. No matter how much time passed, no matter how much life changed them afterward. And perhaps that is what makes this story so emotional today. The movie was about going back in time, but in real life, time was the one thing none of them could escape. When Back to the Future exploded into theaters in 1985, it instantly became something unforgettable. The movie arrived during a golden era of American cinema, a time when films still felt magical, adventurous, and emotionally sincere. Audiences walked into theaters expecting a fun science fiction comedy. What they experienced instead became part of cultural history. The DeLorean speeding through empty streets at night, fire trails burning across the pavement, Marty McFly hanging onto the back of a pickup truck with a skateboard beneath his feet, and Christopher Lloyd's wild-eyed performance as Doc Brown turning every scene into pure chaos and genius at the same time. The movie felt electric. Young audiences saw excitement. Older audiences saw nostalgia. And somehow the film connected generations in a way very few Hollywood movies ever managed to achieve. Because underneath the comedy and time travel, Back to the Future was really about something deeply emotional. The fear of time itself, the fear that life changes too quickly, the fear of losing people, the fear of becoming someone you never expected to become. And perhaps that emotional truth is why audiences never let the film go. For millions of Americans, Back to the Future became attached to memory itself. The soundtrack, the clock tower lightning scene, George McFly finally standing up for himself, Marty looking at a photograph terrified that his own existence might disappear forever. Those moments stayed with people, not just because they were entertaining, but because they felt human. Michael J. Fox became one of the defining faces of the 1980s almost overnight. His energy, humor, vulnerability, and natural charisma made Marty McFly feel real in a way audiences instantly connected to. Christopher Lloyd became legendary. Lea Thompson became part of one of the most iconic movie families in American cinema. And together, the cast created something timeless. But while audiences continued revisiting Hill Valley year after year, real life was becoming far more complicated for the people behind the movie. Because fame at that level changes everything, especially when a film becomes so iconic that the world refuses to separate the actors from the characters they played. And for Michael J. Fox in particular, the emotional story waiting ahead would become far more heartbreaking than anything audiences ever saw inside the movie itself. For millions of people, Michael J. Fox was not just an actor. He was the 1980s. The moment he appeared on screen as Marty McFly, audiences fell in love with him instantly. He had something Hollywood cannot manufacture: artificially natural charm. His performances felt effortless, funny without trying, emotional without becoming dramatic. Marty McFly became the teenager everyone wanted to be, Cool, confident, quick-witted, but also vulnerable enough to feel real. And almost overnight, Michael J. Fox became one of the biggest stars in America. Back to the Future turned him into a cultural icon, but the truth is, Fox was already exhausting himself long before audiences understood how overwhelming his life had become. During the peak of his fame, he was filming Family Ties and Back to the Future at the same time. He slept only a few hours each night. Entire days blurred together between movie sets, television studios, interviews, travel, and non-stop pressure from Hollywood. The world saw success. Michael saw survival. Because fame at that level stops feeling glamorous very quickly. It becomes pressure, expectation, exhaustion. And despite becoming one of the most beloved actors of his generation, Fox quietly carried deep insecurity beneath the confidence audiences loved so much on screen. Then, in the early 1990s, everything changed. At just 29 years old, Michael J. Fox was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis was devastating. Doctors told him he might only be able to continue working for a few more years. Suddenly, the young actor who had built an entire career around energy and movement was facing a disease that would slowly take control of his body away from him piece by piece. And at first, he hid it from everyone, including the public. While audiences continued laughing at his performances and revisiting Back to the Future endlessly, Fox was privately dealing with fear most people cannot even imagine. Tremors, anxiety, depression, the terrifying uncertainty of wondering how quickly his body would change. And perhaps worst of all, the emotional pain of knowing the world still saw him as forever young, while he quietly battled a degenerative disease behind closed doors. For years he tried to maintain the illusion. He kept acting, kept smiling, kept pretending everything was fine. But internally, the emotional weight became unbearable. Fox later admitted he turned to alcohol during parts of that period, struggling to emotionally process the reality of what was happening to him. Fame no longer felt important. Success no longer felt exciting. Survival became the priority. Yet somehow, what makes Michael J. Fox's story so powerful is not simply the tragedy. It is the humanity. Because instead of disappearing completely, he eventually made a decision that changed how the world saw him forever. He told the truth, publicly, honestly, and when he revealed his Parkinson's diagnosis to the world, audiences were heartbroken. The same young man they remembered skateboarding through Hill Valley with endless energy was now speaking openly about fear, illness, and losing control of his own body. But something extraordinary happened after that moment. People did not stop loving Michael J. Fox. They loved him even more, because the world finally saw the person behind Marty McFly. Not the movie star, not the icon, just a human being trying to survive something cruel with dignity. As the years passed, Fox became a symbol of resilience around the world. His foundation helped fund groundbreaking Parkinson's research. His interviews became increasingly emotional, and audiences watching him grow older often felt something difficult to explain. A mixture of inspiration and heartbreak at the same time. Because every tremor reminds people of time passing. Every public appearance reminds audiences that nobody stays young forever, not even Marty McFly. And somehow, that painful reality made Back to the Future feel even more emotional with age. The movie was once about adventure. Now it feels partly about loss, about memory, about trying to hold on to moments before they disappear. But while Michael J. Fox became the emotional soul of the Back to the Future legacy, another cast member was quietly carrying a very different kind of loneliness behind one of the most unforgettable characters in movie history. For many fans, Christopher Lloyd did not simply play Doc Brown. He became him. The wild white hair, the frantic voice, the unforgettable stare filled with panic and genius at the same time. Every movement felt larger than life. And somehow, despite all the chaos surrounding the character, Doc Brown became the emotional heart of Back to the Future. Beneath the comedy and scientific madness was something surprisingly human: loneliness. Because Doc Brown always felt like a man terrified of time slipping away from him. And in many ways, Christopher Lloyd himself carried a similar emotional solitude throughout much of his real life. Unlike Michael J. Fox, who naturally embraced fame with warmth and humor, Lloyd remained deeply private for most of his career. Even during the enormous success of Back to the Future, there was always something distant about him, almost as if he never fully belonged to Hollywood culture at all. And perhaps that distance is exactly what made his performances feel so authentic. Before Back to the Future transformed him into a global icon, Lloyd had already spent years building a career through unusual, eccentric characters. He was respected, admired, but never truly treated like a traditional Hollywood leading man. Then suddenly, Doc Brown changed everything. The role became immortal, and that kind of success creates a strange emotional contradiction for actors. The world finally recognizes you everywhere, but only as one version of yourself. For decades afterward, audiences could not see Christopher Lloyd without seeing Doc Brown immediately. The character became permanently attached to him in a way few actors ever experience. At first, that kind of legacy feels magical. Eventually, it can feel isolating, because no matter what other work he accomplished, one truth remained unavoidable. To millions of people, he would always be frozen inside 1985 forever. Meanwhile, real life quietly continued moving forward. Relationships came and went. Marriages ended. Years passed. And while Michael J. Fox's battle with Parkinson's became public and heartbreaking, Christopher Lloyd faced a quieter emotional journey, the slow loneliness that sometimes comes with aging inside a legacy. The world refuses to let die. Fans who see him today often become emotional immediately, not because he disappeared, but because seeing Doc Brown grow old reminds audiences of something painful about themselves too. Time passed for everyone. The teenagers who watched Back to the Future in theaters are grandparents now. The movie that once felt futuristic became nostalgia, and the actors who seemed immortal slowly became elderly human beings carrying decades of memory behind their eyes. Yet somehow, Christopher Lloyd still carries traces of Doc Brown even now. The energy, the unpredictability, the strange warmth hidden beneath eccentricity, and perhaps that is why audiences remain so emotionally attached to him. Because Doc Brown was never really just a scientist. He represented wonder, hope, the belief that life could still surprise you no matter how old you became. But behind the emotional legacy of Back to the Future, there were still darker stories waiting. Because while some cast members struggled with aging and illness, others quietly watched Hollywood forget them almost entirely after the fame disappeared. For audiences in the 1980s, Lea Thompson represented something unforgettable. Warmth, beauty, charm. As Lorraine McFly, she became one of the emotional anchors of Back to the Future. Whether she was the awkward teenage girl falling in love at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, or the exhausted older mother trapped inside disappointment and regret, Thompson brought surprising emotional depth to the role. And that emotional contrast became one of the most powerful parts of the movie itself. Because Lorraine's story was really about time-changing people, dreams fading, youth disappearing, and life becoming something very different than what anyone expected. Ironically, Lea Thompson would eventually experience many of those same emotions in real life. During the height of Back to the Future's success, Hollywood saw her as one of the brightest actresses of the era. She was glamorous, talented, and suddenly everywhere. Fame arrived quickly, and like many actors connected to massive cultural phenomena, her image became deeply tied to one specific period in American memory, the 1980s. But Hollywood can be brutally unforgiving toward actresses as time passes, especially actresses associated with youth, beauty, and nostalgia. As newer generations arrived, the attention surrounding Thompson slowly began fading. The giant movie roles became smaller, the industry changed, and like many stars from iconic films, she discovered something emotionally painful. Audiences still loved the movie, but Hollywood itself had already moved on. That emotional disconnect can quietly hurt people for years, because the public still recognizes your face everywhere, while the career momentum that once defined your life slowly disappears. Yet unlike many actors destroyed by fading fame, Lea Thompson adapted in quieter ways. She continued working steadily in television and directing while building a more grounded life outside the impossible pressure of blockbuster stardom. But there was still sadness hidden inside the nostalgia surrounding Back to the Future. Because every reunion, every interview, every appearance beside Michael J. Fox reminded audiences how much time had passed since the movie first changed their lives. And perhaps nobody felt that emotional shift more strongly than the cast themselves. The young actors who once joked together on set eventually became older adults, reflecting on mortality, illness, aging, and the strange emotional burden of carrying one of Hollywood's most beloved legacies forever. For Lea Thompson especially, revisiting Back to the Future often feels less like revisiting a movie and more like revisiting another lifetime. A younger version of herself frozen permanently on screen while real life continued moving forward outside the frame. And maybe that is the hidden sadness inside nostalgia itself. The audience gets to preserve the memory perfectly forever, but the people inside the memory must continue aging in real life. Still, compared to what Michael J. Fox would eventually endure publicly, many of the cast members considered themselves fortunate, because while the world celebrated the emotional legacy of Back to the Future, Fox was privately fighting a battle against time that grew more heartbreaking with every passing year. And somehow, the deeper his struggle became, the more emotional the movie itself became for millions of people watching him grow older. As the years passed, something painful began happening whenever audiences looked at Michael J. Fox. They no longer saw only Marty McFly. They saw time itself. Every public appearance became emotional. Every interview carried a strange mixture of admiration and heartbreak, because viewers could visibly see the effects of Parkinson's disease growing stronger year after year. The tremors became harder to hide. Walking became more difficult. Even simple movements sometimes looked exhausting. And perhaps the cruelest part of all was this: Michael J. Fox was still mentally sharp, funny, and emotionally alive inside, while his body slowly betrayed him in public. For longtime fans, it became devastating to watch, because audiences remembered him as endless energy. The skateboard, the running, the fast talking, the confidence. Marty McFly represented youth, moving at full speed. Now the world was watching that same man struggle against a disease that steals movement itself. And yet somehow, Michael J. Fox never allowed the illness to completely destroy his humanity. That is what made his story so powerful. There were moments he admitted feeling fear, hopelessness, depression, anger, because Parkinson's is not simply a physical disease. It becomes emotional warfare against your own body every single day. Some mornings, standing up becomes difficult. Some days, speaking clearly becomes exhausting. And through all of it, millions of people continued associating him with one of the most energetic characters in movie history. That emotional contrast became almost unbearable. But instead of disappearing from the world completely, Fox transformed his suffering into purpose. His foundation became one of the leading forces funding Parkinson's research globally. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Scientists, doctors, and families around the world began seeing him not just as an actor, but as a symbol of resilience. And perhaps that transformation became even more emotional than his movie career itself, because Michael J. Fox stopped being merely a celebrity. He became hope for people terrified of losing themselves to illness. Still, there were heartbreaking moments that audiences could never fully forget. Interviews where his trembling became impossible to ignore. Award ceremonies where standing still looked physically painful. Reunion appearances with Christopher Lloyd, where fans struggled not to cry simply watching the two men together again. Especially because Christopher Lloyd still looked at Fox with the same warmth audiences remembered from Back to the Future decades earlier. Suddenly, Doc Brown and Marty McFly were no longer fictional characters. They were two aging human beings confronting time together in front of the entire world. And perhaps that is why recent Back to the Future reunions affect people so deeply emotionally. The movie was once about adventure and possibility. Now it feels partly about mortality, about friendship surviving age and illness, about trying to preserve pieces of the past before they disappear forever. Fans watching Michael J. Fox today often feel something difficult to describe. Not pity, something much deeper. Grief mixed with admiration, because they are watching someone lose physical control while somehow refusing to lose emotional dignity. And maybe that is the real reason audiences remain so attached to him after all these years. Michael J. Fox reminds people of something terrifyingly human. None of us can stop time. None of us stay young forever. And eventually, life changes every person in ways they never expected. But somehow, even after all the illness, all the pain, and all the years, when audiences see Michael J. Fox smile, they still see Marty McFly underneath it all, still trying to outrun time itself. Today, nearly 40 years after Back to the Future first changed movie history, the film no longer feels like just entertainment. It feels personal. For millions of people, watching Back to the Future now is like opening a time capsule filled with pieces of their own lives. The music, the DeLorean, Marty skating through Hill Valley beneath bright California sunlight. Everything feels frozen in time, but the audience is no longer young, and neither are the people inside the movie. That realization alone has made the legacy of Back to the Future far more emotional with age than anyone could have imagined in 1985. Because when audiences revisit the film today, they are not simply remembering a movie. They are remembering themselves, who they were when they first watched it, the people they watched it with, the version of life that existed before time quietly changed everything. And perhaps no one carries that emotional weight more heavily than Michael J. Fox himself. For years, audiences saw him as the symbol of endless youth and energy. But over time, his real-life struggle with Parkinson's transformed the emotional meaning of the movie completely. Back to the Future was once about escaping time. Now it feels like a reminder that nobody can. Not Marty McFly, not Doc Brown, not the audience, not any of us. And somehow, that painful truth made the film even more beautiful. Because despite illness, aging, heartbreak, and loss, the emotional connection people feel toward the cast never disappeared. If anything, it became stronger. Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox, reuniting on stage years later, became one of the most emotional moments in modern Hollywood nostalgia. Fans watching them together often cried instantly, not because the reunion was sad, but because it represented survival, friendship, memory. Two men carrying decades of history behind their eyes, while the world around them continued changing. Even Lea Thompson later admitted how emotional revisiting the film became over the years. The cast understood something audiences were slowly realizing too. Back to the Future had stopped being simply a movie about time travel. It had become a story about time itself, about youth disappearing, about growing older, about trying to preserve moments before they vanish forever. And maybe that is why the film still affects audiences so deeply across generations. Because beneath all the comedy and science fiction, Back to the Future understood something terrifyingly human. Life moves fast. Parents grow old. Friends disappear. Bodies change. And eventually, every person becomes nostalgic for a version of life they can never fully return to again. Yet somehow, the movie still leaves people with hope. Because even after all the pain surrounding the cast, all the illness, all the aging, and all the heartbreak, the emotional magic survived. The DeLorean still feels iconic. The clock tower still matters. And Michael J. Fox still makes audiences smile the moment he appears on screen. Not because he remained frozen in youth, but because he showed the world what grace looks like after youth fades away. The fame faded. The years passed. But the emotional connection never disappeared. And somewhere, every time audiences hear the words Great Scott, or see fire trails racing across the pavement, they are transported back to another version of themselves. A younger version, a hopeful version, a version still believing there would always be more time ahead. Maybe the most heartbreaking part of Back to the Future was never the fear of changing the past. It was the realization that nobody can stop the future from arriving. Not even the people who once made the world believe time travel could fix everything. Today, audiences still watch Marty McFly race through Hill Valley exactly as they remember him, young, energetic, fearless, untouched by illness or age. Christopher Lloyd still bursts onto the screen with chaotic brilliance as Doc Brown. Lea Thompson still smiles beneath the glow of another decade that now feels impossibly distant. Inside the movie, they remain frozen forever, but outside the movie, life kept moving. Michael J. Fox grew older while fighting a disease that slowly changed nearly every part of his physical life. Christopher Lloyd quietly became one of the last living reminders of a vanished Hollywood era. The cast members who once looked immortal slowly became human in the eyes of the audience. Fragile, aching, mortal. And perhaps that emotional contrast is exactly why Back to the Future hurts differently now than it did in 1985. Because the movie itself became a time machine, not for the characters, for the audience. People revisit the film and suddenly remember who they were when they first saw it. Childhood bedrooms, old movie theaters, parents who are now gone, friends they no longer speak to. Entire chapters of life that disappeared quietly while nobody was paying attention. And somewhere inside all of that nostalgia sits Michael J. Fox still smiling through unimaginable physical struggle while reminding the world that courage does not always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes courage looks like simply continuing forward, even when your body no longer cooperates, even when the world keeps comparing you to the younger version of yourself, even when time keeps taking things away piece by piece. That is what transformed Michael J. Fox from a movie star into something far more emotional. He became a symbol of resilience, of dignity, of survival. And perhaps that is why audiences feel so protective of him today. Because watching Michael J. Fox grow older feels strangely personal to millions of people who grew older beside him. Back to the Future once made audiences dream about going backward in time. But now, the film reminds people of something far more painful. No matter how badly we want to relive certain moments, life only moves in one direction, forward. The DeLorean became immortal. The movie became legendary. But the people inside it were always human. And maybe that is why the legacy of Back to the Future still feels so emotional after all these years. Not because it was simply a great movie, but because it captured something every person eventually experiences. The heartbreak of realizing time is the one thing nobody can outrun. Yet despite all the sadness surrounding aging, illness, and loss, the magic somehow survived. The music still gives people chills. The clock tower still matters. And every time Marty McFly steps out of that DeLorean, audiences still feel the same spark they felt decades ago. For a brief moment, time stands still again.